3. Sawyer's Holler. Once we put the matter to discussion, it didn't take long for the three of us to decide upon a course of action. Brom Van Dyer had spoken 2 days prior during a stint at Irvine's Single Bar with Josiah Cutchin, a man who dwelt with his wife and daughter in the southeastern corner of the county, and made his living felling large pines for lumber. Cutchin had told the stern-eyed doctor and all else who would listen in shaky syllables that his children were having trouble sleeping. The storied old visions of the lurker in the wood had taken hold of them, and Cutchin knew as well as any around Irvine the creeping death which followed in the footsteps of such visions. He had pleaded for aid, and given that Cutchin was well liked in the town, his young family earned a place in the barn loft of Hayden Sawyer, whose pigs had been wiped out down to the last sow by the unknown hunter which came down from the hills last winter. It would give the Cutchins a warm, dry place to sleep a full 12 miles from their homestead and, it was hoped, throw the thing which stalked them off the trail. Van Dyer thought it best we start there, and his logic was sound enough. If the hunter, or hunters as I was fast coming to believe, were somehow linked to the dreams, then speaking to Cutchin might give us a clue as to where we'd find our elusive prey. If death were shadowing Cutchin, and we meant to intercept death, this was our best chance. We saddled our horses and rode out the gate well before noon, taking the doctor's lead as he wound off up the winding way to Sawyer's Holler. The morning was chill and foggy, and sleek gray clouds had swallowed the sun overhead, lending our sojourn out of the town a somber mood. It made me feel as if the sky itself was doubtful of our purpose, and would have weighed far heavier on me if not for the company of those who rode alongside me. Zachary Walker was impressed by the dragoon pistols I carried, and after handing me his old blunderbuss so I could look the antique over, we got to talking about campaigns long past. I played the coy game of an old soldier and tried to talk my way around the really harrowing or heroic tales. I recounted simple stories of the stinking foot rot which had plagued us in Florida, or the drastic swings from frigid to sweltering which had accompanied the break of dawn on the windswept prairies out west. Walker held no such reservations, and as we three sallied on down the roads into the eastern reaches of the county, the old man talked my right ear clean off from where he bounced in the saddle to my side. Before the age of 18, he'd ridden with the Virginia Mountaineers away from his birthplace in what would one day become Kentucky to harry British soldiers under Washington. After this, he'd taken to the frontiers much as I had, scraping out a living as a long hunter before being pulled into Indian fighting when the Aboriginals would strike at the townships and forts he lived in. Like a hard-headed Visigoth barbarian, he'd tally aloud how many Chickasaw scalps he'd taken for bounties down in Alabama territory before its entry to the Union. A modest 102, by his reckoning. Walker was insistent that once, waylaid by a lone and apparently unnamed Shawnee bandit on the roads through the Cumberland Gap, he had thrown a hatchet overhand at the warrior in an attempt to spook him, and had inadvertently split the savage's skull clean in two. He then wove me a yarn about how he'd once bowled a chieftain of the Creek Indians off his horse in the midst of a raid with a blast from his old blunderbuss, and thereby scattered the whole horde of Creek warriors to the four winds. Here and there along the road he'd take a nip from his refilled flask before spiraling off into his recollections once more. There was no telling how much or how little of Zachary Walker's energetic storytelling was fiction, but the scars along his sturdy forearms and the casual confidence of his mannerisms told me they weren't wholesale fabrications. The man was a big talker, but he was also a tenacious fighter, and it was only because of that tenacity that he felt comfortable weaving extravagant yarns for his newfound junior companion. I grinned and nodded along, finding I liked Walker quite a bit. He was wizened and bent like a dying oak tree, But in that declining frame dwelt a spirit with the virility of aging dynamite. From what I could see, the years had only served to make him more dangerous. Van Dyer, by contrast, was silent. During the 3-hour ride to Sawyer's Holler, he only spoke a few times, usually in response to some light-hearted jibe Walker had made at his expense. He tried to cut into Walker's continuous narrative here and there with his own light-hearted commentary, but I could tell he was more at home in his own mind than on the road with others. That distant demeanor ran deeper than his introversion, though, and I could discern by his frequent glances into the distance along the road that he was troubled. The icy-eyed physician rode with a long rifle over his shoulder, and when Walker jested that the doctor had crafted silver shot for it, I was astonished to learn that it was no jest. Van Dyer had melted down an old set of silverware brought to the long-forgotten Dutch territory of New Netherland nearly 2 centuries prior, when his forebears had crossed the Atlantic. Our quarry was, Van Dyer believed, something beyond the realm of the material, and the hoary whisperings of ghouls and monsters which had been brought to the New World from the Old still ran strong with him. He rattled off names like Strigoi, Wendigo, and Loup-Garou, whose origins ranged from distant and storied Eastern Europe to the ramblings of savage shamans in the far north, where Van Dyer had hunted in his youth. Though the Dutchman made it clear that he did not know what it was we hunted, and it matched none of the weird arcana he'd built up over the years on twisted fables and fey legendry, he had no qualms in saying it stank of the unnatural. The exchange about monsters in the wilds was enough to toss a shroud over the last leg of the journey. The hills had grown to their highest reaches in the region, and the growth was old here, untouched by the hands of loggers or herdsmen who might clear the ancient forests for profit. Though the morning mist had largely dissipated, the moisture hung languid in the air far down in the valleys so that, when viewed from our path along the ridges through the framing walls of the mighty old trees, the forest seemed to float upon a silver sea. Walker still cracked wise here and there, but the atmosphere seemed stiff, and the mood of us 3 intrepid travelers showed it. It was only when Traveler's head sank low with ears flattened out like a stricken dog's that I realized we weren't the only ones who were silent. Then came the smell, though I was not the first to comment upon it. Zachary Walker waved his drooping old cap aloft over his bald skull as if to ward off swooping bats and proclaimed that hell had finally opened up over Kentucky, and that we'd best prepare for the sulfur to start coming down on us. Van Dyer scanned the trees, but he kept moving, and we trailed him. It was then that I told the details of my strange night upon the trail up to Irvine. While I'd mentioned the empty roads and the eerie atmosphere in the clay house in town, I'd not wandered into the weeds with the particulars. The silence and the miasma which hung so heavy all around us were identical to those I'd felt in the woods south of town, and I made sure everyone's hands stayed close to their weapons as we crested the final hills which led out into Sawyer's Holler. The holler itself was a dreary place. I'm sure under different circumstance the valley would hold a certain guarded charm, but that fog-haunted, quiet day was no such circumstance, and the towering old pines that seemed to lean over the barren, rocky walls of the holler were nothing less than intimidating. Though the prevalence of pines meant the undergrowth was less thick here, their towering silhouettes and jagged limbs seemed almost malevolent. As we drew deeper into the vale and the mist grew thick in the trees, this effect was amplified as the shapes grew ever more vague, and our imaginations were left to fill in the gaps which lingered between the trunks. When the road bottomed out and the shapes of buildings reared up out of the vapor to greet us, Van Dyer gasped so sharply that Traveler nearly bucked beneath me at the sudden sound. Then I saw what the doctor had seen, and it was my own turn to groan like a sinking ship. We slid tentatively off our mounts, and we bathed in the awful grandeur of the sight. They had been nailed to the closed front doors of the Sawyer barn like herbs left to dry by way of wooden stakes driven by brute strength into the planking. Each member of the Cutcham family was positioned on the entrance itself, and above them, feet just shy of the doors, hung Hayden Sawyer. Every man, woman, and child among their number had been raked, clawed, and gouged. So damaged was one of the Cutchin children's corpses that it seemed little more than a set of disembodied limbs, though as we drew nearer, the cored-out torso and remnants of a skull came into view through the mist. The barn's aging black siding was slick and oily with the aftermath of the slaughter, but though the gore had aged thick and stagnant over what must have been hours in the open, not a single buzzing fly stalked the arrangement of the dead which marred the doors. I cannot say I was surprised. Since the silence had fallen over us, I had, on some level, expected the worst. The horses had been jumpy, and I could see during the ride into the Holler that even Walker had grown pale. That did not blunt the brutality of the scene. It was not the first time I had seen corpses mauled or violated. Long years searching through burned-out towns only to find horrid displays erected by native raiders weighed heavy on me still. This, however, was different. It felt like mockery, like the whole of the scene had been carefully constructed, that we might look upon it and realize how dreadfully late we had been. For the briefest of moments, I wondered if the hunter, or hunters, in the hills had known we were coming. "It's still here," Van Dyer said. His voice was almost a rasp, his eyes raking the black trees. "Then let's make sure we kill the fucker before it trusses us up like trophies," Walker said. The old man's attention had lingered on the corpses even more briefly than mine, and he'd been wheeling his horse around and around with his gun aloft as if he expected the thing to burst from the vapor at a moment's notice. I agreed. The whole vale seemed to have gotten more still, and the odor had only grown thicker with time, a stink which had little to do with the corpses that hung in the damp gray afternoon before us. Van Dyer pointed us up towards Sawyer's old house past the barn, the building little more than a dark outline against the gloomy gray. "Let's get into the farmhouse," the doctor ordered. "It'll give us elevation. If whatever's out there breaks in after us, we can lie in ambush. It's better than waiting out here in the open." "The houses didn't do all the others a lick of good," Walker commented. "They'll break right in there with us." "You'll get better use out of that blunderbuss in a confined space," Van Dyer interjected, waving us along. "Same with his pistols. If you want to be sure you kill what's out there, then kill it right." Walker hesitated, but Van Dyer did not. He grabbed up the reins of his uneasy horse and led it for Sawyer's farmhouse. The Dutchman's lean, willowy legs carried him off out of sight around the barn faster than I could respond. I reached out and slapped Walker's shoulder before following, bringing the older man along with me, hesitant at first, but almost jaunty as the thrill of the situation sank its hooks into him. This was starting to feel like a fight to me, and I figured it must be much the same to Walker. We almost bumped into Van Dyer in the mist. He stood facing the broad side of the barn, rifle raised. When we saw the splintering hole that yawned jagged like a dragon's maw there, we all knew at once this was the place it had all started. Perhaps Sawyer had come from the house to check on the Cutchins, or perhaps the Cutchins had called for Sawyer in the interest of making a common defense, when the silence fell and the mist rolled in. Whatever the case, the feeble old wall had been broken in as if under the onslaught of a battering ram, and the aftermath hung behind us on the entryway. I started to ask why we had stopped, to urge that we keep up our pace, but a noise issued from the depths of the black interior of the barn. At first it was half imperceptible, so low it was mired in the creaks and groans of the old nails and aged wood in the moist air. It quickly rose to a languid moan, loosed by a sad, sonorous voice I thought must belong to a dying child. There was a twinge of disgust that welled up in my stomach like bile at the sound. The voice was wrong, too warbling and too broken, like the child were being softly shaken or spun. The horses bolted. Van Dyer's broke back across the clearing towards the road we'd come in on, and Walker's horse followed behind. Traveler, who had braved the thunder of more than a few gunfights and heeded no crash or clamor, hesitated only a moment before he pulled away and went right along with them. We almost didn't notice. The moan was still coming, and our eyes were, like Van Dyer's, trapped by the darkness in the barn. There was never a question of going in. We didn't need to converse to decide it was no living child in there. Indeed, we backed up, waiting for something to emerge. I gripped my rifle as if it were the sole rope tethering me to the earth, and watched wide-eyed for whatever came next. A flash of motion caught our eye at the very crest of the hole. Through the haze, a pair of strange hands gripped the top of the breach from within. Great claws splayed from them like swords, but despite this, they seemed nimble and steady. My finger twitching above one of my rifle's triggers, I watched as a snouted head sank down from behind the splintered wall and leered out at us, hanging upside down just beyond our sight like some massive monkey from the tropics, I thought. Though the mist kept me mercifully blind to the details, I saw great bat-like ears in the glint of beady black eyes. Yellowed teeth slick with blood lined a mouth which seemed almost elastic. It looked a sort of chimera of all the horrors which man dreamt waited for him in the wilderness, and nothing I've ever seen in person or illustration has ever come close to freezing my veins so totally as that thing from the barn. Walker fired. I had been so chilled by the appearance of the inexplicable crawler that I had not the foresight to take advantage of the target. Van Dyer, for all his collected calm, seemed to have been equally stricken, but Zachary Walker had hit the thing clearly in its godless face with a blast from the blunderbuss. The noise cracked me into clarity, but by the time I was prepared to act, the thing was already moving. It scuttled like a four-armed spider, its clawed forelimbs long and gangly and its rear limbs short but poised. Its fur was black as midnight and glistened with the wet slick of its kills. It made no noise of agony, nor did it pause to consider its wounds. The sole sound was that continuous, childlike moan that issued from its still lips as if by some foul puppetry rather than by speech. The thing merely swung itself up and out of the barn, then clambered up the exterior wall and onto the roof, where it made to sink back out of sight. The thing was massive, several times larger than a brown bear. I shot it twice in the back in the perhaps 2 seconds it spent slipping up the wall of the barn, but again, it made no sign that the heavy round from my rifle's twin barrel did it any harm. It was only when Van Dyer, in the very moment it crested the roof, shot it through its furry flank with his own rifle that the beast ceased to moan and began to wail. The noise was much like that I'd heard during the first night in the county, hyena or coyote-like. It had the cadence of tittering laughter, but the shrill pitch of a whining dog. This was not mocking or frantic, though. It was pained, wheezing and gurgling. There came a clatter of claws as it scrambled over the opposite edge of the roof, and a thud as it hit the ground on the far side. Walker whistled, nodding his approval. About to comment on the shot, I guessed, but Van Dyer did not stick around to hear it. He was off in pursuit almost immediately, reloading his gun on the move with the practiced ease of a man who has hunted big game. I made to follow, slinging my rifle down to the ground and drawing a pistol from my brace, and Walker did the same. But by the time we had rounded the barn, the doctor was merely a silhouette in the mists, headed for the forest. I called after him as we pursued, but he did not slow. I have questioned over these long intervening years why Van Dyer chased so recklessly. Maybe the long march of corpses in Irvine had sunk deep beneath his skin, and his rage got the better of him when he heard the thing cry out in pain. He had, after all, been the man tasked with examining most of the locals. His own acreage had seen corpses trussed up like hung criminals. Perhaps he felt personally responsible for ending the strangeness which had crept down from the hills on clawed limbs into town. Whatever the case, he entered the woods hot on the trail of the thick black blood which gouted from his quarry to coat the brittle grass. "That wasn't no savage," Walker wheezed as he ran, still grappling with his astonishment. I could do little else but nod. Zachary Walker and I had not breached the tree line when the second rifle blast rang out. There arose another cry, more shrill and animalistic than the first. Then, silence. I passed Walker a pistol so that he might discard his emptied blunderbuss, and we pressed through the brush shoulder to shoulder, leaning around pines with weapons raised. We followed that stinking black blood, weaving between pines and scuttling over boulders, the sole trace the beast had ever left during its many hunts. Through this ran the spaced tracks of the towering Dutchman, whose long strides had nearly paced his prey. When we found him, he was already dead. His throat had been torn open, and the end likely came swiftly for him. His rifle, freshly fired, had fallen in his grip, his eyes wide and sightless after the awful glimpse of the thing which killed him. I ordered Walker to watch the forest. Though we could hear the screeching beast moving further up the hills, I was wary of more trickery, and I didn't want to risk it wheeling around and coming back for us. With the old man's cover, I holstered my pistol, stooped, and prepared Van Dyer's ornate rifle for another shot. Mad as it sounded, no, mad as it was, the doctor's silver rounds had worked. I didn't plan on leaving them behind. Dragging the remains of sturdy Van Dyer behind us, we made for the clearing, defeated and shaken, yet all the wiser for it. We would need to rethink our approach if we were to tangle with a monster which no lead could harm.